Hello and welcome to the course Introduction to Brain and Behavior. I am Ark Verma. I am an assistant professor of psychology in the Indian Institute of Technology, Kanpur. I work in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences and also the program for cognitive sciences in the institute. This is the first week. We are talking about the structure and the function of neurons and the nervous system broadly. In today's lecture, I will like to give you an overview of the nervous system. This is actually the fifth lecture. Now, looking at the nervous system, it is primarily can be conceived of in two parts. First is the central nervous system, which basically contains mainly the brain and the spinal cord. So, you can see that here. So, the brain and the spinal cord here. This is basically referred to as the central nervous system. And the central nervous system you can think of this as the main command and control center of the entire nervous system, in some sense of the entire body. Okay. So, this is where all the computations that we perform basically take place. Then you can see that this the central nervous system has these branchings off which basically extend to other parts of the body, the entire body. This system of connections through nerves and ganglia is called the peripheral nervous system, because this basically represents what is called, or what can be called, a sort of a courier network that delivers sensory information from the central nervous system to other parts of the body, and also the motor commands from the central nervous system to other parts of the body. Say for example, again going back to the old example, if you are touching something very hot, the brain processes it and it will need to release a motor command for your hand to kind of move itself away from the thing. One way it could be happening through just kind of reflexes, the other way it could be happening through a sort of a decision kind of a process. Okay. So, this is a very important system. It basically makes use of two kinds of nerves. One is the nerves in the somatic motor system, which controls the voluntary muscles of the body, things that you move by choice sort of, and then there is the autonomic motor system, which controls visceral functions like sneezing, coughing, breathing, and some of these other things which are autonomous, and they do not really require some kind of a decision making process to intervene. Now, let us go into a little bit more of detail into the autonomic nervous system first. Now, the autonomic nervous system basically it controls the involuntary action of smooth muscles, say for example the ones in the heart and the other kind of glands. And the autonomic nervous system basically can be seen as divided into two kinds of systems. Yeah. So, the autonomic nervous system basically can be seen to have two kinds of subdivisions. One is the part of the sympathetic system. Now, the sympathetic system basically what it does is it uses the neurotransmitter norepinephrine, and basically mainly it plays a role in preparing the body for a fight or flight kind of action. It basically operates by increasing the heart rate, diverting the blood from the digestive tract to the somatic musculature, and preparing the body for action. So, it is something that will kind of say for example, if you are in a slightly heightened emotional state, if you are, let us say, very angry or very happy or very aroused, or you are preparing yourself for some kind of a competitive physical activity, this is the system that will prepare your body for this kind of a thing. The other system is the parasympathetic system, and the parasympathetic system basically uses the neurotransmitter acetylcholine as its main agent. Now, the parasympathetic system acts almost opposite to how the sympathetic system acts. It basically works for cooling the body down. It basically works for bringing the body from an excited state to a slightly calmer state, to a slightly more sedate state. So, what it does is, using the neurotransmitter acetylcholine, it basically tries to slow down your heart rate, it tries to stimulate digestion so that more energy can be sort of generated, and it also helps the body with functions which are germane to maintaining the body. Say for example, processes of healing. Suppose you have you're coming off some very strenuous physical activity, like maybe a 5-kilometer run or something like that. So, basically what the parasympathetic nervous system would do is that it would sort of restore the body to its normal, its more relaxed and safe state. So that is basically the job of the parasympathetic nervous system. And this is where you can visualize them, the parasympathetic and the sympathetic branch. Here you can see that how the two kinds of systems act on these different organs. So you can see, for example, while the sympathetic branch will dilate the pupil so that more light can enter the eyes and better visibility is achieved. The parasympathetic branch will constrict the pupil, restricting the flow of light and sort of leading you towards sedation. Similarly, the sympathetic nervous system will stimulate the tear glands, whereas the parasympathetic system would inhibit the tear glands and so on. All of these are basically two sort of a set of functions which work almost like yin and yang for the body. One is typically making the body ready for action, and the other is basically restoring the body from tiredness and from harm that might have come across in that heavy exercise or action phase. Let's focus our attention now to the central nervous system. Now the central nervous system, as I said, is composed of mainly the brain and the spinal cord, and both of these organs are encased in a protective bony shell. You know that the brain is covered in the skull, and the spinal cord is also covered in this bony covering, and they are both suspended in a sea of cerebrospinal fluid, which is just some kind of fluid which is basically helping the brain to be suspended and to not really every time you are running, say for example, if there were no cerebrospinal fluid, your brain would get injured by just rocking against the walls of the inner walls of the skull. But because of the cerebrospinal fluid, that is not there, and it sort of saves the brain from a lot of jerks and rapid head movements and so on. That said, the brain and the spinal cord are covered with three kinds of protective membranes, which are collectively called meninges. The outer and the thickmost layer is called the dura mater, the middle layer is called the arachnoid mater, and the innermost and the most delicate layer is called the pia mater, which basically is something that is adhering to the surface of the brain. Now this cerebrospinal fluid that I was talking about, it basically fills up the subarachnoid space between the arachnoid membrane, between the second layer and the last layer, which is your pia mater. As well as it is filled in the brain ventricles, cisterns and sulci, which are the gaps in the brain. We will see that in more detail moving further, and also it is filled up in the central canal where the spinal cord is housed. Okay, so this is said. Now in the central nervous system, neurons are bunched together or can be organized in various kind of ways. One of the ways is via nuclei. So a nucleus is basically, it can be said to be a relatively compact arrangement of nerve cell bodies and their connections, ranging from very few, just hundreds of neurons to millions of neurons at once, having basically functionally similar kind of inputs and similar kinds of outputs. They are located throughout the brain and the spinal cord. Now the outer layer of the brain, basically the outer part, so one of the ways is being arranged into a nucleus, the other is being arranged in the form of a layer. So this outer layer of the neurons is basically what forms your cerebral cortex, which contains billions and billions of neurons, and they are arranged in thin sheets laterally, and they are folded across the cerebral hemispheres. You will see that when we talk about the structure of the brain, we will see that there are these processes, there are these structures called the sulci and gyri, which is basically just sheets of these neural arrangements which are folded in forms of just like, say for example, some kind of fondant icing on the cake. Now if you take a slice of the brain, if you just cut it across the way it is being demonstrated here, you will see that the brain is composed of two kinds of matter, or two kinds of matter are visible. First is the grey matter. The grey matter is composed of the cell bodies of neurons, and then there is this white matter which is composed of axons and glial cells. So axons is where basically the communication is happening, whereas the cell bodies are in the slightly upper grey matter portion. Now the axons of the neurons in the brain are grouped together to form tracts that run in association from one region to another, sometimes within a hemisphere, and sometimes they cross the hemisphere and move towards the other hemisphere through what are called commissures. We will see all of these things in a lot of detail going further. Now, the largest of these fiber tracts that you can see basically connects the two hemispheres together. So, this is the right hemisphere, the left hemisphere. There are these bunch of fibers that are connecting the two hemispheres. This is basically through a lot of these axon fiber tracts, and this structure is called the corpus callosum. So, basically callosal fibers. Finally, there are these projection tracts that run from the cerebral cortex to deeper subcortical structures and in the spinal cord. So, these projection tracts from the axons can actually run deeper into the brain, and also they can kind of extend themselves to the spinal cord. Now, we have talked about the central nervous system, we have sort of begun talking about it. There are two major parts in the central nervous system. We will talk about the brain. But before we get to the brain, we can talk a little bit about the spinal cord as well. Now, the spinal cord is that cord that extends from the brainstem down towards the tailbone. It basically, the main task is that it takes the sensory information from the body's peripheral sensory receptors, so your arms and limbs, and it basically relays it to the brain. So, from here to the spinal cord to upwards in the brain, and it basically also does a very important job of connecting the final motor signals from the brain to the muscles. So, for example, if the brain signals that you have to pick up this glass, this signal probably originated in the brain through the brainstem, went to the spinal cord, and then reached these efferent nerves so that I could just lift this glass. Okay. Further, each level of the spinal cord has these different kinds of pathways which are also referred to as the reflex pathways. Now, these reflex pathways, as I was mentioning earlier, reflex pathways are very rapid, quick pathways that are responsible for involuntary but rapid action. Say for example, the knee jerk reflex, if you are tapping somebody on the knee with the hammer, and if you hit the right spot, the person will create what is called a knee jerk response, which is basically in response to being hit at the right spot, and the leg will flex in a further direction very quickly. Okay. So, this is basically referred to as the knee jerk reflex. The spinal cord basically runs from the brainstem from at about the first spinal vertebrae at the top, and it terminates at the lower structure called the chorda equina, and it is enclosed in this bony vertebral column, which is basically a stack of separate bones that are just their whole job is to protect this spinal cord, which extend from the base of the skull to the tailbone or the coccyx. This vertebral column can be divided into sections such as the cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral and coccygeal, and this is basically also the spinal cord is divided into 31 segments. Each segment has a right and a left spinal nerve that enters and exits the vertebral column through openings called foramen. So, basically the spinal cord is receiving these inputs from both the left and the right part of the body, and these nerves are entering the vertebral column through these openings called the foramen. Each spinal nerve has both sensory and motor axons. Sensory inputs are basically carried through the dorsal root to the spinal cord, and the efferent neuron carries the motor output through the ventral root away from the spinal cord. So, the action part basically is through these motor axons which are basically going from the spinal cord to the efferent nerves, and the sensory part is basically from these peripheral nerves and converging towards the spinal cord, so that the signal can be communicated to the brain and upwards. Now, the peripheral portion, the back portion of the spinal cord is made up of white matter, tracts, axons, while the central region is made up of grey matter consisting of neuronal bodies. So, we are talking about how the spinal cord and how this entire system is created. It resembles a structure resembling a butterfly with two separate sections. One is called the dorsal horn, one is called the ventral horn. The dorsal horn contains sensory neurons and interneurons, whereas the ventral horn contains large motor neurons projecting to muscles. The interneurons basically they project to motor neurons on the same side and also on the opposite side of the spinal cord to aid in the coordination of limb movements. When we go further, we are talking more about the motor functions and so on, we will discover that the left side of the body is controlled by the right part of the brain, the right side of the body is controlled by the left part of the brain, and basically this is achieved through these interneurons which are projecting both towards the ipsilateral and the contralateral sides from the spinal cord, basically controlling the movements. Now, before I move further, this is a very good demonstration from Gazzaniga's book, wherein we can talk about some kind of geospatial coordinates of the brain. Whenever I am talking about dorsal, I basically means the top portion of the brain. This is the dorsal portion, let us say, of the dog's body. Caudal basically means the posterior portion here at the back. Rostral means the front bottom portion, and ventral means the lower portion. So, dorsal, ventral, rostral and caudal. So, this is something that will basically help you to sort of locate when I am talking about these specific areas of the brain, and when I am mentioning these terms like dorsal prefrontal cortex or ventral prefrontal cortex and so on. So, just sort of remember this, you can come back to this slide again and again whenever there is a confusion in terms of which locations I have been talking about. Now, let us move further. Let us from the spinal cord, let us enter to the brain stem. You can see here that this is the spinal cord, and this structure here up till here actually is basically referred to as the brain stem, and the brain stem basically consists of three main parts, basically the medulla, the pons and the cerebellum. We will talk about these three areas in some detail now. Now, medulla is the most caudal portion, you can see it is the caudal yani backwards portion of the brain stem, which is sort of a continuation of the spinal cord itself. Now, it basically houses the cell bodies of many of the 12 cranial nerves, the nerves in the skull, providing sensory and motor innervations to the face, neck, abdomen and the throat. So, this is a very, very important region as regards the movement of the face, neck, abdomen and the throat. Also, the medulla controls vital functions such as respiration, heart rate and physiological arousal. Now, the motor neurons that originate in the right hemisphere cross basically to control muscles on the left side of the body, and the motor neurons that originate in the left hemisphere cross basically at this point to control the muscles on the right side of the body, as I was just mentioning. The medulla also acts as a relay station for all kinds of sensory and motor information between the body and the brain. So, here we are talking about all these sensations coming from different parts of the body to the spinal cord, aggregating at the top of the brainstem in the medulla, and then from the medulla being communicated to different parts of the brain, and then the signal will come back also and will basically be dissipated in the same manner. Okay. So, in that sense, the medulla acts as crossroads for most of the motor fibers of the body. Also, the medulla controls several autonomic functions, involuntary functions such as the reflexive actions that determine respiration, heart rate, blood pressure, digestive and vomiting processes, coughing, sneezing, those kind of things. Now, the other important structure in this brainstem is this structure called pons. You can see it here, this is where the pons are located. The pons basically is the main connection between the brain and the cerebellum. So, we will talk about the cerebellum at the back, but between the brain and the cerebellum, and it is basically made up of a vast system of fiber tracts which are interspersed with these specific nuclei. When I was talking about nuclei, is this bundle of cell bodies I was talking about couple of slides ago. Now, these pons basically they receive synapses from many cranial nerves in the skull region, including the sensory and the motor nuclei from face and mouth. So, this is also a region which is very, very important for facial movement. Now, pons are also essential for eye movements as well as the movements of the face and mouth, as I was just saying, and basically it is also supposed to be responsible for generation of rapid eye movement sleep. If you remember, sleep has two kinds of cycles, non-rapid eye movement, non-REM sleep and REM sleep. We will talk about this maybe at a later point. Now the final thing that we can talk about, or one of the other things that we can talk about, is the cerebellum. The cerebellum is this surface. It's at the back of the brain. It's also called the smaller brain in colloquial sense. The surface of the cerebellum appears basically to be constructed of these thinly spaced parallel grooves, which basically form a very continuous layer of tightly folded neural tissue. So you can see that this is basically tightly folded layers of tissue that you can see here. It basically forms the roof of the fourth ventricle and sits on what are called the cerebral peduncles that are large and basically have large input and output fiber tracts in the cerebellum. What I will do also is, as I was mentioning in the last lecture, I will put some anatomy videos in the links when these lectures are uploaded, and you can kind of go through these anatomical videos, and where you can actually see these areas visualized in a more animated form, so that they make a little bit more sense to you than these 2D pictures. Now structurally, the cerebellum is divided into the cerebral cortex and 4 pairs of deep nuclei and also internal white matter. Now fibers basically arriving at the cerebellum basically project into the cerebral cortex, bringing in information about the motor outputs and sensory inputs, and which sort of also describe body position. Say for example, the orientation of the body, the size of the body, the movement of the body, and so on. The inputs from the vestibular projections which are responsible for maintaining body balance, as well as auditory and visual inputs also project to the cerebellum from the brainstem. Also output from the cerebellum, basically outputs from the cerebellum originate in these deep nuclei, which you can see in the figure here, and basically then they move from these deep nuclei to the motor and premotor cortices in case of ascending, going upwards, and some of them which come down to the brainstem and the spinal cord, which are descending projections. The cerebellum is very important for maintaining posture, for walking, and for performing coordinated movements, say for example tapping the piano, or say for example playing an instrument like the tabla or something like that. So these are fine movements, writing, all of these are grossly controlled and handled by the cerebellum. Also an important contribution of the cerebellum is that it integrates information about the body, size and speed and orientation and so on, with the motor commands. Say for example, if I throw a ball towards you and you have to catch it, basically the movement will be based partly on the inputs that are received at the cerebellum, which sort of will keep inform you about your current body position and how it has to be changed in order to accomplish a particular task. Further, the cerebellum modifies the motor outflow to affect smooth coordinated movements, the ones that I have been talking about. And if the cerebellum is damaged, basically it can lead to severe consequences as far as motor actions or movements are concerned. Your movements would become uncoordinated, there will be no smoothness in them, and they will become jerky, and it will also become very difficult to maintain posture and balance and to walk straight and to maintain an upright posture and so on. People, symptoms might resemble the people who have disease called Parkinson's disease, who have jerky and uncoordinated movements. Now also the damage to cerebellum can have significant consequences for other kinds of cognitive processes like language, attention, learning, and mental imagery. So this is more about the cerebellum that I wanted to say. We can move further into the midbrain. This is how the midbrain sort of looks. The midbrain basically is resting on top of the pons. This is the inside of the brainstem. It joins the third and the fourth ventricle. The dorsal portion, the top portion is basically referred to as the tectum, whereas the bottom portion is referred to as the tegmentum. I don't really have to exactly remember each and every of these things, but just sort of remember when some of these things will be referred to in later chapters. Now large fiber tracts basically course through the ventral regions from the forebrain, from the front of the brain to the spinal cord, cerebellum and other parts of the brainstem. So this is basically sort of a realization of that kind of thing, and it basically contains two sets of nuclei. You can see here, at the top there are these two nuclei called the superior colliculus, and then there are these two just at the bottom of bottom, which are called the inferior colliculus. So the superior colliculi basically play a role in perceiving objects in the periphery somewhere. If something is situated in my peripheral vision, and it basically helps me orient my gaze towards that object. And then there is this inferior colliculi, which basically used for orienting towards auditory stimuli. Suppose I am talking to you and somebody at the back somewhere calls my name, the inferior colliculi will help me orient my hearing towards that particular source of sound. Finally, there is this red nucleus. I do not think we are seeing that in the figure here, but there is also this set of nuclei called the red nuclei, which are also involved in aspects of motor coordination. Finally, we can move slightly more upwards, slightly more internal from the midbrain, from the brainstem, midbrain, and now upwards we can talk about the diencephalon, which contains the thalamus and the hypothalamus, also the pituitary gland. So, let us talk about the thalamus and the hypothalamus. Now, thalamus is located, as you can see, almost in the center inside of the brain, almost inside of the brain in the center, and basically it is connected by a bridge of grey matter called the massa intermedia. You can see the massa intermedia here somewhere. Inside this you will find the thalamus. So, massa intermedia, the thalamus is referred to as the gateway to the cortex. So, everything that is coming from this peripheral nervous system to the spinal cord, to the brainstem, through the medulla, etc., are projected to the thalamus, and from the thalamus basically all the projections go to all the other parts of the cerebral cortex or the brain. Okay. So, it is referred to as the gateway to the cortex, as all sensory inputs make synaptic relays in the thalamus prior to entering the primary cortical sensory areas. The thalamus is involved in relaying primary sensory information, and it basically receives input from basal ganglia, cerebellum, neocortex, and the medial temporal lobe. So, it is basically gaining all of this primary sensory information and relaying it to the other parts of the brain. It sends projection back to these areas also to create certain circuits which are used in several kinds of functions. The thalamus also relays motor information to the spinal cord. Okay. So, this kind of forms this kind of a loop. Now, incoming information can be organized and channeled to relevant areas according to the connection pattern formed by the neuron. So, incoming information that is coming to the thalamus from various parts of the nervous system, from the peripheral nerves through the spinal cord and coming to the thalamus, basically has to be organized in a particular manner and channeled to relevant areas as the need, as per the need, as per the priority. Now, the thalamus contains three or some important set of nuclei. One of them is the lateral geniculate nuclei or lateral geniculate nucleus. Now, the lateral geniculate nucleus basically receives information from the ganglion cells of the retina from the back of the eyes, and it basically sends axons to the primary visual cortex. So, through the thalamus it sends these connections to the primary visual cortex. Then there is the medial geniculate nuclei. The medial geniculate nucleus basically receives information from the inner ear and sends axons to the primary auditory cortex. Then you have the ventral posterior, at the back and the bottom ventral posterior nuclei that project the somatosensory, all kinds of touch related tactile information to the primary somatosensory cortex. And finally, there is the pulvinar nuclei, which are basically involved in orienting attention and integrating integrative functions that involve multiple kind of cortical areas. So, these are the set of nuclei that are very important in the thalamus. We can talk a little bit about the hypothalamus as well. Hypothalamus is just this region under the thalamus. You can see, if this were the thalamus, this region here under the thalamus, you can see it here under the thalamus is the hypothalamus. It is a very important site for hormone production and control. It has also a small collection of nuclei and fiber tracts, as you can see. Now, the hypothalamus receives input from the limbic system and other kinds of brain areas. It is responsible for controlling the body's circadian rhythms, which basically does by getting inputs from the reticular formations, amygdala and the retina. Some of these regions I am mentioning here, you will see the figures and use of them again and again as we go through the different chapters. Now, basically the hypothalamus sends projections to the prefrontal cortex, the amygdala, the spinal cord and the pituitary gland. So, these are the three regions where the hypothalamus mainly projects. It controls the functions for maintaining the homeostasis of the body, maintaining the normal equilibrium of the body by sending out signals that drive behavior to sort of address whenever a need or whenever some kind of emergency arises in the body. Say for example, if you are thirsty, hungry, feeling too hot, too cold, too excited or unrested and the body needs some kind of sleep. So, all of those basic housekeeping things or something that maintains the equilibrium of the body is handled by the hypothalamus. This is a very important region. It controls these things through via controlling the endocrine system, the system that generates these neurons, these hormones sorry, and the pituitary gland. So, also what the hypothalamus sort of does is it produces the hormones itself, but it also produces factors that might control or manipulate the rate of production of hormones in different areas. So, one example is that, say for example, the hypothalamus sends projections to a region called the median eminence and an area where it releases peptides into the circulatory system of the anterior pituitary gland, the front portion of the pituitary gland, where basically it can eventually control the generation of thyroid stimulation hormone, the adrenocorticotropic and the gonadocorticotropic hormones, which have different kinds of functions. We will talk about them when the need arises. Now, neurons from the hypothalamus send projections to the posterior pituitary gland as well, and they can stimulate the gland to release hormones like vasopressin and oxytocin, in the blood, basically to regulate water retention in the kidneys, milk production in lactating females and uterine contractions and so on. So, in that sense it kind of takes care of some of the very important functions of the body. Finally, we can talk about the Telencephalon. So, we are kind of moving upwards from the spinal cord to the brainstem to the midbrain to the Diencephalon, which has the thalamus and the hypothalamus, and now moving slightly more further up, wherein we come across three kinds of systems: the limbic system, the basal ganglia and the cerebral cortex. Is made up of these three very important regions. The cingulate gyrus, you can see it here, the hypothalamus, which is just below the thalamus, the anterior thalamic nuclei, some of the nuclei that we have mentioned, and the hippocampus, which is this region here. Now, this is a very important network, and we will talk about the detailed implications of what this network does in one of the later chapters, but this is just to give you a brief hint. Is basically implicated in regulating emotional behavior and regulating behavior with respect to responses like fear, judgment of emotions, etc., and certain aspects of memory also. So, this is something one has to remember. Then we can talk a little bit about the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia are a collection of nuclei bilaterally located on both hemispheres deep in the brain beneath the anterior portion of the lateral ventricles near the thalamus. So, basically just around here under the thalami. These basically, the basal ganglia include different kinds of nuclei like the caudate nuclei, the putamen, globus pallidus, subthalamic nuclei and the substantia nigra. We will talk about some of their functions maybe at a later time. Now, the caudate nucleus with the putamen together are referred to as the striatum, and the striatum basically what it does is it receives projections from the thalamus, as the basal ganglia receives input from the sensory and the motor areas. Now, these nuclei which we have just mentioned as part of the basal ganglia are involved in very important brain functions like action selection, action gating, motor preparation, timing, coordination, fatigue and things like task switching. So, these are some of the very important functions of these regions of the brain. And finally, the basal ganglia also play a very important part in what is called reward based learning and goal oriented behavior. So, basically behaviors that lead to pleasurable reward based outcomes. These are some of the regions that process those kind of outcomes and may lead to us learning those behaviors better and so on. Okay, so we've sort of covered two portions of the Telencephalon, which are the limbic system and the basal ganglia. I will talk about the cerebral cortex in the next lecture. Thank you.